So I want to start off with a little narrative first to give you a sense of why I'm interested in what I'm interested in. So the problem that I study is the racial achievement gap. And so I'll begin with a story that will make it obvious as to why I study this topic. So I'm from Brooklyn, New York. How many people from New York? Okay, so if you're from New York, you'll realize that you can live in a certain area of a borough in New York and really think that the world ends outside of that space, right? And so I grew up in Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn, and you have everything you need in downtown Brooklyn. You don't feel like you're missing anything. So that's where I grew up. And growing up, I was raised by my grandmother, who had an 8th grade education, and my grandfather, who had a 3rd grade education. So my mom passed away when I was 5, and so she raised me and my sister. And growing up, college wasn't something that we talked about, right? That wasn't something that was part of the story for us. So for her, she just wanted us to finish high school. That was her main goal. So when I was growing up, I didn't really know about colleges and universities. So, and really, I never really ventured outside of Brooklyn. We didn't have a car, which is not uncommon in New York, right? It was the norm. We didn't have a car. We lived in the projects and the low-income housing. For those of you who, I don't know if you've seen the projects in New York, it's like you've seen The Wire, the show The Wire on HBO. Okay, that kind of scene. So that was the scene. And the first time I ventured outside of Brooklyn was when I went to high school. I went to a high school called Manhattan Center for Science and Math, where I proceeded to fail both science and math. And it's on the east side of New York, so it's 116th Street and FDR Drive. And so I would take the 6th train to 116th Street and walk to the FDR Drive. And I did not venture to the west side of Manhattan, so I didn't know what was there. Never went to the Bronx. Didn't know what was in Queens either. No one knows what's in Staten Island, so that's cool, So I just knew downtown Brooklyn. That was what I knew. That was my world, and then the 6th train. And when I graduated from high school, in a class of 242 students, my class rank was 217. So that's the 10th percentile. So thinking back, I would say, the counselors and the guidance counselors in my high school were not concerned with the students. But now I realize, no, they probably weren't focused on the 10th percentile, the students down there, right? So, but that was my experience. And so I did not know about colleges and universities. I knew about Brooklyn College because we lived in Brooklyn. I knew about LIU, Long Island University, because they have a campus downtown Brooklyn. And I knew about NYU because Theo Huxtable went to NYU, right? But Columbia was a country. And I didn't know about like Rutgers or Arizona State or University of Michigan. I would have found it strange that you're putting the name of a university and the name of a state together. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. I wasn't a college sports fan, so I wouldn't have known that. So college just wasn't on the radar. And so instead, I was looking into trade school to be a mortician. I wanted to be a mortician. Really, I wanted to be an embalmer, and so I would go to a funeral home, hang around in the back, and there was a funeral home that was nice enough to let me go and watch them embalm people, and that's what I wanted to do. I thought it was something respectable, and you tell people you're an embalmer, and people say, oh, okay, it doesn't matter what's happening with the economy, you always have a steady stream of business. And so that was what I wanted to do. So I was looking into this. And I had a friend in high school who had twin aunts, Danette and Darlene. And they had completed their undergraduate work at Cornell. And they said, you should go to college, get the experience, try it out, see if you like it. So they gave me 4 applications to complete. One was Grambling State, Morgan State, Hampton, and Lincoln in Pennsylvania. So these are all historically black colleges and universities. Now, I had no idea, I didn't know about any colleges outside of Brooklyn, let alone HBCUs. I didn't know what they were. But I applied to these schools. And Grambling was the only school to accept me. And they accepted me on a conditional basis. First semester was kind of, probationary student type. Because my GPA when I graduated high school was something like a 169. I mean, it was really, really bad. I mean, I was a 10th percentile. But I finished. And so I wasn't going to go to Grambling because, it's in Louisiana. And remember, I had never left New York. In fact, the furthest I'd been in a car was to Newark International Airport, which back then seemed like a long drive because you generate, you generate some speed in the car where you're going past 55 miles an hour. You don't generate that kind of speed in Brooklyn unless you're on the BQE. And that's 8 miles from Brooklyn. Anyway, so I wasn't going to go to Grambling. And Danette, called me 2 days before dorms were set to open in August. This was August of '93. And she says, do you want to go to college or not? And I said, I don't know how I'm going to pay for it, because I thought at the time that you had to pay all of the money up front because, growing up, we never financed anything. We didn't own a car. We paid for everything cash or food stamps, right? So there's no such thing as like the concept of borrowing or loans didn't exist for me. So I thought you had to pay all the money up front and then you attend. And they said, no, there's financial aid, that's not how it works. So I said, sure, I'll go. And they said, we'll just pack your bags. We'll work it out. So I pack my bags and I tell my grandmother that I'm going to Grambling State University. Now, this is the first time she ever heard Grambling State University. It was the day that I left for Grambling State University. So I told her I'm going to this place called Grambling State University. She says, where is it? And I said, this is Louisiana. And she asked me if it was in another country. And I said, no, it might as well be, but it's not. And she had no idea where it was. The other thing is that, she had never really left. I mean, her life was lived in this, like this 4-block radius, just there in Puerto Rico. And so all this was happening in Spanish. And so she says to me, she had some major concerns. Her primary concerns were, one, how are you going to live? How are you going to make it? Two, I was going off the grid. So she could place me if I'm going down the street to a friend's house. She could imagine, she could picture where I'm going to be. But now I was leaving the New York area, and she had no concept of where I was going. And her third primary concern was that I was 17 at the time. So in her mind, you're a minor. What if something happens to you? I could be charged with neglect. So these were her primary concerns. I'm telling her, no, it's going to be okay. They have this thing called financial aid. I'm trying to explain to her something that I just learned. And so she was certainly nervous. So Danette and Darlene show up in a 93 Crown Victoria. They had rented this car. So it was the two of them with two of their friends from law school. And they show up in this car, and I have my bags packed, and I get in the car, and they start driving. And I remember, we stopped in Maryland for gas, and I remember thinking, man, this is a long way. And we were 4 hours into the trip. We had 20 hours left to go. I also remember thinking, wow, this is beautiful. And I was talking about I-95 because I had never been on an interstate before. There's no interstate in New York. I mean, 95 cuts across the Bronx, but it doesn't look like an interstate, right? And the BQE certainly doesn't look like an interstate. So it was the first time where I had, been in a car and saw just hours of just nothing but just what you see, just trees. And you see that in Prospect Park, but you know that there's a bound to that, right? So that was all new for me. And so we get to, 24 hours later, we get to Monroe, Louisiana. And, we spend the night in the hotel. Danette and Darlene fund everything. They fund the entire trip. And we get there, and I remember thinking, okay, this is a different world. It's northern, rural Louisiana. The white folks were different from anything that I've seen before in New York. The black folks were different from anything I've seen in New York. There were no Asians. There were no Hispanics. It was a different world. And, we spend the night, and then the next day we get up, go 30 miles, and we drive to Grambling. And we get to Grambling State. Danette takes me to my dorm room. She checks me in. Darlene comes back. She disappears for some time. She comes back. She says, okay, you fill this out for your coursework. You fill this form out for your financial aid. You go stand in this building to register. And then they gave me $30. And after about 45 minutes, they got back in the car and drove to New York. And I was dropped off at Grambling State University in northern rural Louisiana. First time outside of, the Brooklyn, East Manhattan. Okay? So it was a huge difference, right? And when I got there, I remember thinking, wow, I'm on a college campus, And I had the image of, how you see the image of people walking out the building with the backpack on their back, talking to someone, and there's grass, and somene's reading and sitting against a tree, reading a book. And I say, this is a real college campus. I had that image. And I realized then that a shift had occurred in my life, right? That Danette and Darlene had done something that had really changed the trajectory of my life in a way that I could appreciate after that. Particularly because now I look back and I realize they were young, they were kids, they were children. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Anyway, they changed the context of my life. At the time, they were adults, they were grown-ups to me. But now I look back and I realize they were young kids, you know. So I got to Grambling and I majored in psychology. And I majored in psychology because I thought you could read people's minds. And so that's why I wanted to major in psych. I've since realized that that's not the case. And I graduated Grambling with a 3.34. It was a modest GPA. And one of the things that changed was a professor there, my first psychology class, he gave an example where he said if a child's misbehaving, you can tell people, look, Johnny's misbehaving. Or you can say, in the past hour, Johnny has kicked 3 kids, slapped 4, and punched 5. And then you can let them determine whether or not that's misbehavior and how much misbehavior that is. So he essentially operationalized misbehavior for me. And after that, it changed the way I took in knowledge. It was like every time someone talked to me, I went through this bad stage where I would always say, so-and-so is nice. What do you mean? What do you mean by nice? I wanted them to operationalize what nice meant, right? Tell me what nice is. What's the definition so I can determine how much niceness there is, right? And it changed my connection to information and how I filtered information. Completely changed it. So after that, I graduated with a BA in psychology. I applied to graduate school, and Kansas State University was the only school to accept me. So I went to Kansas State University for a master's in college student personnel work. The stigma of that was weighing on me, so I walked over to the social department before the semester started, and I transferred over to sociology. And I received a master's in sociology, and I applied to a PhD program in sociology, and Michigan was the only place to accept me. So I always tell people you only need one school, that's all. So when I come visit, the grad students are saying, what other places are you considering? And people say, I'm Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard. And for me, it was like, well, my mind's made up. I'm coming to Michigan, And so I ended up coming to Michigan for a PhD in sociology in '99. And then the policy program begins in '01, the joint degree program. And so I was the first cohort in that. And I finished that program in 2005. And when I finished that program, I ended up having a reversal of fortunes. I won the Distinguished Dissertation Award. I took a postdoc, and UT Austin recruited me out of the postdoc. And so I spent a year on the faculty at University of Texas at Austin. And in my first year there, I was recruited by Princeton and NYU, and I ended up going to Princeton. 4 years later, I got tenure at Princeton. And so that brings us to today.